Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the October garden checklist video. I do one of these each month in the garden here in Raleigh, North Carolina, Zone 7B. Just kind of showing off some of the things that Steph and I are doing on a month-to-month basis. There was a video a couple of years ago, the October one from 2 years ago is much more detailed probably. At this point when we do these videos, we're just talking about what we have going on for the month of October, which should be likely similar to what you have going on as well. Of course, October is the month that we're likely to get our first frost, and that's pretty typical here in my area of North Carolina. Sometime toward the end of October, we'll see our first frosty morning. I'm kind of looking forward to it. Summer was pretty tough. Of course, what that means for a lot of these annuals is they're going to be removed during the month of October as they decline. Many of these things like this gomphrena are still in full flower right now, and of course, bees are still on them all afternoon. So as long as we can go here, we will. October is, it's in the South here, the best month for planting woody shrubs and hardy shrubs into the landscape. And the reason for that is the cooler nights and the shorter days mean that the plant just doesn't need a whole lot. When you're transplanting them, it won't need a lot of inputs from you, except for water. Water can be, October can be a very dry month. The air is typically drier. We can get hurricanes and tropical storms and that kind of thing, but for the most part, we don't get those types of events, it's very dry here. So we're planting, it's easier on the plants, but we do have to do some watering on them. So we have a lot of super interesting shrubs and perennials that are actually going into the ground during the month of October. Some of these annuals have to make way for them though, so we're waiting for that transition to kind of happen during the month. A couple notes on fall planting is I only plant things in the fall that are definitely hardy here in my Zone 7B area. I'm not going to plant marginal things, things that are, barely hardy. I wouldn't plant bananas even though there are some bananas that I can grow here, or palms or things like that. As long as they're hardy though, I'm sticking them in the ground for sure. Again, a lot of these annuals are going to make way, and some perennials and some shrubs are going to be planted into those spaces, but I do maintain some annual spaces here, and there are some winter annuals that we'll be putting in during the month of October. I wait for the soil temperature to cool down below 65 degrees. I got a little inexpensive soil thermometer you can get on Amazon. I'll link one down below. It's $15, $16, something like that. It's a great tool because there are a lot of, when the soil temperature falls below 65, we can plant pansies, snapdragons, dianthus for winter color here. And when the soil temperature comes back above 65 in the spring is when I actually plant my tomatoes and peppers and those kinds of things. So that soil thermometer comes in handy a couple times a year. So again, pansy, snapdragons, and dianthus will be planted. Another thing you could be on the lookout for right now is fall blooming perennials or shrubs. We have here in the South, of course, we have lots of camellias that'll be blooming very soon. Caryopteris is blooming right now, is a shrub that's blooming. There are hardy chrysanthemums, not those little balls that you get off the tables, at the garden centers and box stores right now. But there are actual hardy ones that will come back every year very, very reliably. I will say they can be a little weedy. Some of them can. They can really take over some space. So be prepared for that if you're using any of those. And then, of course, there are asters as well that will come back every year and bloom reliably in the fall in your garden. So again, Steph and I are going around and we're pulling out some of the annuals that have declined at this point. We're waiting, a little while longer if the pollinators are still using them, like some of the celosia. It doesn't look the best at this point, although there's still some color out here. But the pollinators are still on them every afternoon. We'll wait a couple weeks. Once these come out, this little strip through here will be pansies and snapdragons through the winter. There'll be some bulbs planted in here in a minute. I'll talk more about bulbs in a few minutes. But this space gets prepped as an annual bed each season. So we might mix some pine bark soil conditioner or some additional compost where annuals are going to go. The rest of the beds, as we're cleaning everything out, are going to be remulched. I like to mulch here in the fall with just a small amount of mulch to prevent some of those henbit and chickweed and some of those winter weeds from germinating. It also helps insulate the roots on the plants. Again, fall and early winter here can actually be a little dry in my area, and it will hold in some moisture as well for the rain we are getting. In the back garden, we have a giant oak back there, and it drops tons of leaves. So we'll wait for those leaves to fall. We'll distribute them if they're too thick in some places to other areas. Make sure it's just a thin layer of leaves. We want to keep them, and then we'll put a small amount of a more decorative mulch over the top of them, just to make it look like a finished garden space. One thing about pruning this time of year, this Calocarpa here behind me, Calocarpa americana with the white berries, the birds will take these pretty soon as they start to dry out just a bit. This thing needs a major pruning, but I'm going to wait until the end of winter to prune on it. There's a lot of pruning we're going to be doing out here, but it's not the best time of year going into winter to be, pruning on these things. I don't want to. In some instances, you can create some additional growth at a time you wouldn't want any additional growth. Plus, you have to look at it like that the rest of the winter. It's not going to grow back. So this plant needs to come down about 3 feet this winter, because that's about how much it grows back before it does this every year. And this is about the size I want to keep it. But I'm going to wait until the end of winter to do that. So if you got pruning things at this point, I would hold off on major pruning things. If you've got one crazy limb on something, just prune it off whenever. That's not a thing you need to stress about. But general pruning, I'm going to wait until the end of winter. But I also have to be careful when I say this to you, because there's some things you won't want to prune until after they bloom in the spring. And so if you don't know what you have, wait until after it blooms in the spring. But something like this that blooms on new wood next year toward the end of winter, I'm going to hack it way back. I get fertilizing questions all year long. I only fertilize in the late winter with the organic fertilizer just once a year on all the shrubs, perennials, trees in this landscape. The mulch breaking down, the leaves breaking down that I just talked about, that's what's actually feeding this garden. And of course the soil that's here underneath it already has all the mineral content in this clay-based soil that the plants would ever need. So I'm just keeping it covered, watering when it needs to be watered, and nature's taking care of the fertilizing for the most part, except for containers. Occasionally need some ongoing fertilizer, more fertilizer than just once a year. And when I transplant the vegetable garden out, so we've gone from a summer vegetable garden to a fall vegetable garden. We're going to go take a look at that in just a minute. It'll get an application of an organic fertilizer right now. It's actually been done and it hasn't been fertilized yet. So that needs to be done. And when the pansies go in the fall here, they'll get a small amount of organic fertilizer. Again, I just don't give them a whole lot because we've done so much soil prep here, and we do a good job of keeping the ground covered, and that's what's feeding the plants. So no fertilizing, no general fertilizing on anything unless you're putting an annual thing in, like a fall vegetable or a fall flowering thing like pansies. Transplanting season, okay? When it gets cool out in your deciduous plants like hydrangeas or something like that drop their leaves, that's about the time to start thinking about transplanting things around the garden. That's when it's the lowest stress on the plant. We have a lot of things. I've got a Dahlium and a little conifer and a boxwood here that are a foot apart, and this boxwood was put in because we just needed to get it in the ground. The container, it wasn't happy in the container it was in. This is not its permanent home, and we're going to do some transplanting here once these annuals come out. We've got some space out here, but we planted so many flowering things this spring that they've eaten a lot of space. And so we're going to do a little bit of transplanting, but we're waiting. About the time the annuals come out of the ground, when we get that first frost, it'll be the perfect time to move a few of these shrubs around that are a bit too close together. One other big thing that's happening here in the month of October will be bulbs. This year we went with a different thought process on bulbs, and we're just going to go with bulbs that will naturalize in our area. So we're not going to be planting the big tulip groups that we've done in the past and the hyacinth groups that we've done in the past, just because they don't naturalize here, and just trying to reduce the footprint that this garden has on the world. Basically is what we're trying to do. So we're ordering something that can go in the ground and stay in the ground, or the things that get switched out in the garden, the annuals and things, we're doing from seed, and we're doing, and then we're composting them at the end of the season. Again, just trying to reduce our footprint on the world overall from this garden. And so we'll be receiving our bulbs during the month of October. If you are doing tulips and hyacinths and things like that in the south, you might want to you need to acquire them earlier because they need to go in the refrigerator for some period of time. And so those of you in the north don't have this issue, but we do need to cold treat. So the bulbs that you're buying, or the bulbs that you've already purchased, or the bulbs that you've ordered, you may want to look up in your area and see if they need to be cold treated before they go in the ground. Because again, tulips, other than a few species, tulips are not perennials here in my area in the south. They need to be cold treated in order to come up. We just don't get enough winter cold. One other thing you're going to see in the fall that people get very panicky about is evergreens thinning. And that can be evergreen conifers like this boulevard cypress, or it could be an evergreen plant like this boxwood. You can get, because it is dry, these plants will sometimes do a lot of interior thinning, and people get pretty panicky about it. If you're seeing an excessive amount of interior thinning, that probably does mean that they went into late summer and early fall way too dry. And it might be something that you can think about in the future. That I, from having done this for so long, know that toward the end of summer, early fall, especially on these conifers like this is when they do the majority of their growing. It's actually cool outside. I could have a jacket on right now here on the right at the end of September when I'm filming this. This is the most growth I've seen on some of these little conifers all season long. This is the time of year they do their growing, in the early spring and in the late summer. In the middle of summer, they were like, oh, why is it so hot out? Why is it so hot out? And they weren't growing. So keep an eye on your conifers, keep an eye on your evergreen shrubs. If it's very dry where you are, which I know a lot of people watching, it definitely is. Otherwise, this interior thinning can kind of get out of control. So maybe you purchase some perennials this year and put them in, the things that die to the ground in the winter and come back every season. You may want to document where they are so you don't start digging over the top of them during the winter or planting bulbs over the top of them, so you can mark them with some sort of tag. It can be a golf tee, is adequate to make sure that there's something there, or map it on paper, however you want to go about doing that. But just make sure you know where they are. Again, the annual things are going to be coming out during the month of October. We will save some of the seeds on many of these things. This is an example. There's dahlias all over the place out here, and this is one of the spent flowers from the dahlias, and we can just open these up, and they're just absolutely loaded. This is all seed right here, all of these individual seeds. And they're amazingly reliable. We just put them in a small glass jar. I don't have to cold treat them. I don't have to do anything with them. Every one of these will germinate pretty reliably in March and then go back, be planted back out in the spring. So a lot of these are pretty easy to collect from seed. We have purchased some seed as well for some perennials, some annuals, and some vegetables. And that video went up a couple weeks ago if you want to see the things that we're going to be doing from seed, where we purchased them versus collecting them out here in the garden. When these perennials are going to sleep and when these annuals are coming out, you're going to find weeds that you didn't expect, that you didn't know you have. So make sure you're pulling those out as well before you're mulching. And then your mulch will be pretty ineffective if you're leaving weed seed up on top of it. But that's some of the things that we're doing as we're kind of in a way, we're putting the garden to sleep for the winter, erasing, this color, getting it cleaned up and getting it remulched. You can see we still have lots of dahlias in flower, and we're here in zone 7 in North Carolina, and we don't dig our dahlias out of the ground. We're right in the marginal area where some will come back and some won't. And again, we're collecting seed on them. So I don't worry about it, but if you're in colder areas, your dahlias need to be, and you want to keep the dahlia tubers, you do need to dig them and store them in the winter. There's lots of videos on YouTube for how to do that. Things like elephant ears, calla lilies, caladiums, there's a lot of things that are probably marginal if you're watching in an area that's slightly colder than mine, where a lot of those things have to come out of the ground. Again, where we are, all of those things I just mentioned are if we had a really bad winter, some of those things might not come back, but again, we're right on the edge of that. But it is during the month of October the time to be thinking about pulling those things out and getting them stored for the winter. Our cool season vegetable garden has been in for 2 or 3 weeks now. There are videos on the channel for this. We had our summer garden here. We would actually prefer to have, or I would we would actually prefer to have our vegetables kind of throughout the landscape and have them as a part of the entire garden. This is the only spot that's really sunny all day long, and we can protect them from our urban menaces, the rabbits. And so we have a rabbit fence around it, and we're able to protect this space pretty thoroughly. Some of these things were done from seed in the house. That would include some of the lettuce back here, a little bit of the broccoli, and then some of these things were direct seeded. All of these things out here in the garden, these are flowering plants just like any other flowering plant. We'll leave them, we'll harvest what we're going to eat for the fall. And then typically we don't have enough time to get the flowers and get the seed going into winter. But we'll do another crop of these cool season vegetables. This is broccoli and carrots and peas and lettuce and just lots of things that, again, those videos are on the channel. In the spring, all of these things will come to flower as they'll bolt, they'll send up flower spikes toward the beginning of summer and form flowers and then seed, and we can collect that seed. And so a lot of these things can be, again, just collected here, and we don't have to purchase even the seed. It can be collected right here in the spot. This is the only thing that will get refertilized out here other than the pansies that are going in. This is a no-till garden. It was tilled the very first time it went in. That's about 2.5 years ago now. We tilled some compost into it, and since then, each time the garden gets transferred out, where it went from summer vegetables to cool season vegetables, a little bit of compost gets added, and then the plants get planted right into the top. The spaces where we've left basically our walking areas through here, we've put down some wood chips. Easy for me to say, but there's just wood chips to make up the paths. The wood chips will break down during the winter, they'll become compost, and then next year they'll just be part of the garden. And so we're just covering the ground with organic material like we are anywhere else. And any place there's a possibility of weeds coming up, we're using the hardwood mulch. And then in the areas where the plants are actually planted, it's just compost. And you can see, the response we get, from that. Everything looks pretty lush in here. It's still very early. One thing we'll do about protecting this from cold, all of these are cool season vegetables, and they can take a minor frost without any problem. But if it's going to get down into the upper 20s Fahrenheit or mid 20s Fahrenheit pretty quick, we have a frost protection blanket that we'll throw over the top of this. If we can protect these 1 or 2 nights in late October, early November, we can probably be picking vegetables out here well into December. If you did any summer herbs, if you want to save any of them for the winter and get them dried, you definitely need to harvest them sooner than later. We've got things like sorrel here. There's a red sorrel. There's still some basil out here. This one's not the best looking one, but we've got some that are better than that. We've got some sage. We've got rosemary. Holly's blocking it all, but there's lots of herbs out here, and we'll go through the stuff that still looks pretty good, get it cut, and get it dried out for the winter. Otherwise, first frost, we'll lose these pretty quickly. So I talk about this giant oak that's on the back property line all the time, and I don't know that I've ever shown it. It's quite a thing. Those leaves have already started dropping because it's been dry. Those, maybe in your area as well, we're seeing fall color much earlier than we normally see it. And leaves are dropping already. That will drop way too many leaves on the back line. I don't want, we won't let those leaves leave this property. We're going to use them as mulch, but it will definitely drop too many in one spot back there. So what we'll do again is the mulching that takes place here in the back garden and the final cleanup of the season will be us waiting for that to completely drop those leaves, and we'll redistribute them around. So it's just basically a thin layer everywhere, and we just leave them intact, and then a little bit of mulch will go over the top of that. As it gets colder, of course, late October, we typically don't get the kind of freezes here until December or January that would cause harm to our irrigation systems. But a lot of you watching live in areas where it's going to get much colder, much quicker. So you need to be thinking about shutting your irrigation system down, making sure hoses are disconnected from hose bibs and those kinds of things. And just generally, you know, this time of year, I'm taking a look at, you know, before I mow for the last time, because here we have cool, warm season grass out in the front garden. It'll go dormant by the end of October. I won't have to do any more mowing. But before the mower goes away, I go ahead and sharpen the blade, I change the oil, I get some of those cleanup tool things done so that when we're pulling that stuff back out in March or April next year, I don't have to think about it at that time as an emergency. A couple other things you may have to think about is if you have some marginal plants in containers, or plants that wouldn't survive through the winter in a container, but it is a perennial in your area, you might want to get those things into the ground sooner than later, or otherwise you may have to spend the winter you know, protecting them, having to bring them in and out of a garage, that kind of thing. Most of the things that we have in containers out here at this point are things that are more cold hardy than our area. So, you know, boulevard cypress is, you know, much more cold hardy. It can sit in this container without any problem for us. There are a couple of things that we would protect if we needed to, but for the most part, we've kind of thought through now most of the things that'll be overwintering. We went and put a palm and some other things in the ground that had been in containers for a couple of years to just kind of lower our overall maintenance here. Definitely October is the month to be taking a look as these annuals are coming out of the ground. You know, we do so many different things in this garden every year, new things, and we're planning on even more new flowering things for next year because I don't want it to be stagnant or the same every single year. We do write down what went well, what didn't go well, things that we'd want to use again, things that we wouldn't want to use again. We may skip a year even on something that we really, really like, just to have something different out here in the garden on a year-to-year basis. So that's something we're thinking about. Cold protection, I talked about cold protection in the vegetable garden. We have a frost protection blanket we can throw over. So it's just a little light cloth blanket. You can get one of these on Amazon pretty inexpensively. If we protect that vegetable garden from a couple of the early frost that we get, we can extend that period of time. One other thing you might have to protect is if you got really cold really fast. I mean, typically here we're going to get nights in the 50s, and then we're going to get nights in the 40s, and then we're going to get a few nights in the 30s, and then we're going to get a light frost, and you know, the things go to sleep. It's possible that you could just go right to 20 degrees Fahrenheit one night from being warm. I mean, that's a possibility, and there are a few marginal plants out here that I'd probably cover in that case. I've got some Fatsia, Fats hedra that's right over here to my right with the variegation on it. You know, a few of these things would not like to go right to super, super cold. And so I will monitor that. That would be an unusual situation. Most of the time, these things are pretty dormant by the time you get significant cold, but anything is possible, so I'll monitor that. And lastly is houseplants. Obviously, before we get a frost, these houseplants have to go inside. We've got a back porch here full of houseplants that have to go in. And again, I think I said in last month's video, or September's video as well, you might take the opportunity to pull them out of the containers, transplant them into slightly larger containers, take some of the old soil off and refresh the soil. That taking them out of containers also gives you the opportunity to make sure you're not taking in a bunch of things that were in the container that you didn't want to take inside, insects. You know, maybe there's ants in one of them. Who the heck knows what's in, you know, your pots after you've left them out all summer long. So no hitchhikers can go in if you do your pot switcheroo. And you may want to, that would be another thing I might put a light application of fertilizer on. Even that, I use an organic fertilizer on my house plants as well. So that's it. That's what Steph and I have going on in the garden here in Raleigh, North Carolina, Zone 7B. If there's anything I missed in this monthly video that you're thinking about for October, definitely leave it in the comments below. Thanks for watching.